After the fall of the Soviet Union, things were very, very bad in North Korea. There was a food crisis. They needed petroleum, gasoline to run their tractors, and they couldn't get it. And their food system came to a grinding halt, and people were starving to death. And it was an absolute disaster. And it was a very, very bad time. And many international observers looked on and they said any other government in the world would have collapsed under those circumstances. But if you look at today, the Korean Workers' Party is still in power. They're still in power. And the grandson of the founder of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, his grandson, Kim Jong-un, is the leader of the country. And if you look at the fact that they got through a huge crisis that they now call the arduous march period in their country, where people were literally starving to death, where their food system came to a grinding halt, where electricity was limited, where things were that bad, but yet the government of North Korea did not fall, you have to acknowledge there's a lot of people who feel very, very loyal to the Korean Workers' Party. And I'm going to tell you some of why that is. And my source for these statistics is the country study published by the U.S. Library of Congress. The U.S. Library of Congress publishes a country study of every country in the world. And these statistics come from the U.S. Library of Congress's country study of North Korea. Between 1948 and 1990, the life expectancy of the average person in North Korea increased by 30 years. 30 years. Can you imagine what a 30-year life expectancy increase means? How much would things have to improve in a country for people to be living 30 years on average more than they did before? In 1955, Korea was recovering from the Korean War. The country had been bombed. Every single building about 1 story tall had been destroyed in the Korean War. And in 1955, North Korea had only 285 hospitals in the whole country. But in 1986, according to the U.S. Library of Congress, they had 2,401 hospitals. And you want to talk about a huge increase in access to medical care. You go from 285 hospitals to 2,401 hospitals. That's huge. That's a huge increase in access to medical care. When the communists took power on the Korean Peninsula, 20% of the population had any kind of education whatsoever. Any kind of education. By 1956, again, just a few years after the whole country had been bombed and destroyed during the Korean War, according to the U.S. Library of Congress, they had wiped out illiteracy in the northern half of the Korean Peninsula. These are huge, dramatic achievements that changed a lot of people's lives, and they were done under the leadership of Kim Il-sung and under the leadership of the Korean Workers' Party, and they were done in the aftermath of a devastating war in which the whole country was ravaged and destroyed by bombs. And they were done with aid from China, aid from the Soviet Union, but there are millions of people who lived through that, and their loyalty to the Korean Workers' Party and to Kim Il-sung was won by seeing how their country was transformed. And we know that North Korea has been in a pretty bad spot since the fall of the Soviet Union, but it hasn't always been like that. And this is from a BBC article that was published, and they acknowledged that prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, North Korea had a bit of success. This is what the BBC article said. At one time, North Korea's centrally planned economy seemed to work well. Indeed, in the initial years after the creation of North Korea, following World War II, with spectacular results. The mass mobilization of the population, along with Soviet and Chinese technical assistance and financial aid, resulted in annual economic growth rates estimated to have achieved 20%, even 30% in the years following the devastating Korean War of 1950 to 1953. And as late as the 1970s, this is BBC, South Korea languished in the shadow of the economic miracle north of the border. And throughout the 50s and 60s, North Korea was building a huge steel industry. They were building huge modern power plants and electricity, and the country was rising up. And again, this is something that we never hear about. But these are changes that made a difference in people's lives. And if it wasn't for the fact that millions of people's lives were very largely transformed by the Korean Workers' Party, they would have collapsed in the 1990s. Another thing that's worth pointing out, since we're talking about North Korea, is we all know that back in the 1960s, there was the Black Liberation Movement here in the United States. And since some of the recent awareness that's been raised of Black Lives Matter. We're starting to acknowledge things like the murder of Fred Hampton. We're starting to acknowledge how, Dr. Martin Luther King was harassed by the FBI and sent a letter urging him to commit suicide. Well, at the same time that the American government was hunting down and murdering and terrorizing Black revolutionaries, North Korea was supporting Black revolutionaries. And in fact, the Black Panther Party was welcomed to North Korea with a huge parade as heroes. And the Black Panthers, they had a relationship with many different governments around the world, but for some reason North Korea was a government that they had a particularly close relationship with. If you look at old issues of the Black Panther newspaper, they've got Kim Il-sung's face on the front page, and Black Panther leader Eldridge Cleaver, when he fled from the United States, he moved to North Korea. One of his daughters was born in North Korea.